On behalf of the Center for African Studies at Howard University, I want to welcome you to this global conversation on countering violent extremism in Africa, the role of religion. My name is Krista Johnson, and I'm the new incoming director of our Center for African Studies here at Howard University. Today's event is part of a series of global conversations around countering violent extremism in Africa that the center is organizing and has been organizing in partnership with the Jimmy and Rosalynn Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University. So I want to begin by thanking and acknowledging Dean Ozerdem of the Carter School, as well as Professor Thomas Flores, who's the Director of Graduate Programs at the Carter School, for their enthusiastic support of this partnership. And we look forward to continuing to collaborate with them on future events. The broad project focuses on extreme violence, conflict, peacemaking, and peace building, particularly in the Sahel region of West Africa. And it aims to bring together both Africa experts and peace and conflict resolution experts in conversation with each other around three themes. So last year, we held our first global conversation, which focused on countering violent extremism and the role of youth. This year, we're focusing on the role of religion, and then probably not in the spring, or maybe in the spring or in the fall of next year, we'll have our third series, which is going to focus on the role of women. And the expectation is that we can culminate in a symposium which really kind of grapples with these issues in a broader context, and then hopefully that will turn into an edited volume. So this initiative for us has been led by a former George Mason, but now at Harvard University professor, Daniel Abiboah. And I'm going to turn it over to him really as moderator of this event and give him the opportunity to contextualize the topic for us and then also introduce the panelists. So Daniel, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Krista, and welcome to you all. We're excited about the next couple of days in discussing issues related to religion and countering violent extremism. Just to talk a little bit about the series itself, it is sponsored by the US Department of Education, and it's a partnership between Howard University, as Krista mentioned, and George Mason University. And we expect that this would run from 2018 when it started through 2021. Now, the participants are quite diverse. We have scholars from various local, national, international institutions. We have public officials, diplomats, faith groups, and community leaders. And this diversity of participants is in recognition of the multifaceted nature of preventing and countering violent extremism in the contemporary world. While this series focuses for the most part on Africa, we recognize that issues of preventing and countering violent extremism are inherently borderless, as we will learn from the various presenters. Now, the first, as Krista mentioned, of our global conversation series was on the theme of youth and countering violent extremism. And the next couple of days, we'll be talking about religion. And for our third sort of global conversation series, we'll be looking particularly at the role of women. So over the next couple of days, we want to explore particular themes when in relation to religion and countering violent extremism, which is trying to unpack and understand what violent extremism is from the perspective of the concept itself, but also the drivers of violent extremism. And then tomorrow, we want to focus a little bit on the practicalities of preventing and countering violent extremism. So I want to look at what works and what doesn't when it comes to these broad field of countering violent extremism. Now, to unpack some of these issues, we have four excellent speakers for today, and each of them bring with them their particular experience, regional expertise to our discussion, to enrich our conversation, to expand and complement what we know about religion in relation to countering violent extremism. So I'll waste no time then in introducing our first speaker. Now, each speaker would have 15 minutes to present their materials, after which there will be a 20 minutes Q&A session, which will be moderated via chat. So keep those questions coming and direct them to particular speakers or to the panelists. Just let us know. After which I will try to give my own overview of what I think are the key points and allow the speakers about 4 minutes to give their final comments. After which I'll close the session by looking ahead to tomorrow and what to expect. Okay then, our first speaker for the series is Dr. Mohammed Fraser Rahim. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Intelligence and Security Studies at the Citadel. He focuses on issues of violent extremism, both domestically and overseas, as well as Islam intellectual history, transnational terrorism, Islam in America, and contemporary theology in the Muslim world. Dr. Fraser Rahim is also the executive director of William International, which is a major counter-extremist organization. Dr. Fraser Ibrahim has conducted research in more than 40 countries on the African continent, as well as the Middle East. So very vast experience on the ground. He was formerly a senior program officer at the US Institute of Peace, where he led their Horn of Africa programs on preventing and countering violent extremism. He also worked for more than a decade with the US government on countering violent extremist issues. Dr. Fraser Ibrahim's recent book, I believe, came out January 2020. America's Other Muslims is very well worth a read. And with that, I will pass it on to Dr. Fraser Ibrahim for his topic, which I believe is de-radicalization and rehabilitation, the engagement of violent extremist actors from Africa and worldwide.
Great, thank you so much. It is indeed an honor and a privilege. I want to thank both Howard University and GMU for this collaboration. I think this type of synergy is needed more than ever. I'm going to try to make this as dynamic as possible. I have 2 PowerPoint decks, and I'm going to fuse between both policy perspectives from religious communities and also engagement from academicians as well. We have some amazing scholars who will get a bit more in depth on matters. And so I'll try to keep that in mind as I'm engaging on the conversation. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint in a second. Just actually, before I start, I think it's important to highlight when we talk about countering violent extremism, and I'm excited that we're engaging this issue from the context of Africa. Academicians are looking at this maybe from the context of political violence. Policymakers might be engaging this from both real-time dealing to disrupt threats as it relates to counterterrorism initiatives. And then certainly religious actors are dealing with the matter at hand, which is the reality of dealing with faith. I think as a broader conversation, I think this is something to throw out right now. We always talk about monitoring and evaluation programs from a context of working from a policy or academic perspective. But what I would encourage us all to do, and I always like to add new knowledge, is this engagement of how would a faith-based approach toward monitoring and evaluating programs as it relates to countering violent extremism or preventing violent extremism looks like. This is something that has not been discussed, but I think moving forward, we are in a position now that for those of faith communities, particularly religious actors, and particularly in the continent of Africa, the end state, the deliverable in terms of what measures and what is success for faith communities, it will be entirely different than maybe US government or X, Y, and Z government on the continent of Africa. This is really important. Secondly, before I engage into the conversation, I think we need to be very mindful of the evolution of the language choice. activists have a different framing of how they engage in what they mean preventing or countering violent extremism. That is an important context, particularly as it relates to how they perceive this issue and how they engage in this issue. Religious actors will have a different perspective, and then also academicians. And I think this is really important as we engage in this broader dialogue. So without further ado, what I'm going to do is, again, share this slide. Hopefully we won't have any challenges at all. And this will be seamless, and is everyone seeing my screen? Hopefully that is an affirmative yes. Am I right?
Yes.
Yes? Great, wonderful. Again, I have 2 decks. I realize I have probably about 3 minutes left because I started my clock a little bit later, and then we'll be able to go from there. So what I want to do is just break down, okay? In terms of, I know many people are visual learners in terms of how they see these issues. Right here, I think is really important as we look at this dialogue, particularly at how groups themselves see themselves, particularly as it relates to Africa. I broke this down into 3 categories. There could be probably 4, 5, 6, 7 more. Non-religiously based extremists, LRA stands out. Islamists, and I use that terminology, Islam, a religion practiced by a faith-based community or a religious community for thousands of years and many different expressions, but Islamism or Islamists taking a strict, narrow interpretation in the form of ISIS, Boko Haram. Foreign terrorist fighters certainly are those radicalized individuals who traveled for elsewhere or traveled different locations to fight. I think it's really important. Several reports have been put out recently from the Pentagon to the UN, to the Global Counterterrorism, GCTF, to the US government, that we know the Islamic State in West Africa has increased their amount of attacks on a repeated basis. We know that the African theater is a location which we're seeing not just attacks in diversity of attacks in groups, but we're seeing an uptick. And so it is certainly a concern for us all throughout the world that the African theater is now a location where we're seeing an emergence, a reemergence, and then now the frontier, the battlefield dealing with extremism. We have the Lake Chad Basin region, certainly. We have Mozambique as another location. We have East Africa and also Libya. So those are 3 locations just to highlight the sort of the problem set. I want to start off to say that, again, as someone who also works real time, de-radicalizing, rehabilitating too as well, I have always been, but more than ever, agnostic of the issues. Leading up to the COVID pandemic, I had a team that was in Africa, various locations in West and East, where we have worked real time on de-radicalization efforts. Religion is not the sole factor or reason why individuals go down a pathway, but that can be one factor out of many factors. And as I'm sure my colleagues will highlight. And so I say that as someone who works this real time, both in domestic context and also overseas, that religion can be one factor, but religious voices and theologians and interlocutors can be an incredible voice to offer a third way. And we'll talk about that in some of the slides, but I just want to highlight just some of the arguments too as well that I think are they're certainly helpful for us all as we move forward. So these, and I just broke these into categories. I think some of the old grievances and narratives that are put out are certainly the Crusades, the Israeli-Palestinian Alliance, and that certainly is taking place, but certainly we know in Sudan as being another country, particularly on the African continent, that's normalizing relations with Israel, how that plans out for the African continent, and then these groups themselves and how they respond, including ISIS or ISWAP, or including Shabab, et cetera. How they respond will be quite interesting. We know that just based off of the deep surface web as well as the dark web, we know that groups are also offering options for individuals to join. For example, there have been COVID clinics that have been set up by members of extremist groups on the African continent, offering a third option for groups and individuals who have been susceptible and vulnerable to extremism as well. Right here, I also offered some of the arguments. I won't spend too much time, but again, some of their arguments and narratives are history, this us versus them framing, the crisis point of Christian proselytization efforts. And this could easily be reversed and switched. We've seen this in the US context as well as in Europe. I'm just offering within the context of Africa. Certainly we've seen the rise of Islamist-based groups. Certainly we know that there could be other religious-based groups, but certainly what's at hand, I think this is certainly important. Certainly some of the arguments too as well, again, this is not the end all be all, this is just some of the framings of how they've seen the world. A method of force and violence, a jihad of only a singular one, that using an aggressive posture to carry out what they see as their desired end state. The fear of contamination, even the terminology use of CVE and de-radicalization. I'll point, and I was going to talk about this later, but just for the sake of time, just so that I don't lose track, I would also just encourage everyone to recognize that the terminology use of CVE, PVE, even in the US, how we say targeted violence can be perceived different. When I was at the US Institute of Peace, I led an effort where we were doing a study and what made communities resilient. And I can tell you what made communities resilient were three factors, at least when we were looking at in Mombasa and then also in Nairobi. One, the sharing responsibility of security, that both the state itself and also communities themselves work together. And secondly, the responsibility there's about four more I could give, but just for the sake of time. Secondly, is that there was an intergenerational exchange between younger people and older people as well. Again, I'm just looking at the track of time because I know I'm gonna run out. Also how individuals see themselves in the world. This happens to be a map that many of us would all agree with, and we can agree. We would certainly be familiar with the known world and some of the locations of the world. This is a framing of how ISIS has seen themselves. And I can tell you there are other, this is even morphed even more in terms of what it looks like in currently as well. What I would just highlight, because I want to highlight just a few points as it relates to religious actors. I think we are now at a point on Africa of where is and how do we engage with post-Salafism? How can we engage with groups who we might not agree with and engage with in terms of their maybe conservatism that does not necessarily equate to extremism? And also, what is it and what does it mean in terms of post-Islamism? Again, I'm putting concepts out there just for the sake of time. In terms of rehabilitation efforts, what I would just encourage and highlight too as well, just a few that I've engaged with. One is called Tafakkur. This is a critical thinking program that fused both the Socratic method and also historically the age-old tradition of Islamic learning. I've done this in 6 countries in West Africa. We've done it in 2 in East, 1 in Southern Africa, and throughout the Caribbean and Europe. A lot of success, and more than happy to share the data on this in the future. I'm going to go to one other PowerPoint just for the sake of time, just so that we don't, just so that I don't miss anything. I think you're seeing this right here. This right here, I think is an important one too as well, just to highlight. As someone who is engaged with religious leaders, I know this is a bit wordy, on a repeated basis, I would just say this, is that I have seen this, I think it's important to set up legislative structures and laws that are in place that work with religious leaders, and particularly religious leaders who are going into prison. From a personal experience working on the issue of de-radicalization and rehabilitation, I've seen religious leaders who they themselves have been radicalized because the points that have been made by other religious argumentation has been, as they would argue to say, it makes sense as well. So I think it's important to recognize the role of religious leaders, but they also too need proper training, and there must be a synergy between religious leaders and also legislation that joins into, that makes sense within X, Y, and Z location, for example, in Africa. In the US context, certainly we know that there's the Establishment Clause, and so we have a separation between religion and state. One of the points that I highlight too as well at the very top, not every religious scholar will be well suited for the therapeutic functions. That is an important point, as I just highlighted earlier. It's a specialized training that individuals need to engage first and foremost in pastoral care. As someone who goes into prisons, and my team that goes into prisons both in the US and also in the African continent, this requires a lot of engagement, and also not just religious theological training will be the sole solution to respond to that. Also, just a few things I'm just skipping for the sake of time, and I hate to do that, but we must move beyond religion too as well. I think some of the recommendations that I would highlight One, and first and foremost, is that societal challenges, including corruption, socioeconomic issues and challenges, are just as important that religious actors can assist with. And oftentimes we only go to religious actors for the context just for spiritual support. So I think that needs to be unpacked. Secondly, think beyond church and mosque. There are other voices that are out there who are younger and belong to movements that might be different, but still within a faith tradition and other African traditional religious practices. I have worked, we did an experimental project in a Caribbean nation I can't mention, and we used individuals who essentially were practitioners of a traditional belief system. Very helpful, very informative, and we were also able to think outside the box. Lastly, how do we avoid advocating for one brand of a religion? The goal is to work across all sectors that can encourage and harness social cohesion in respective countries and also regions. I think this is a really important point. If you take nothing away from this, is those three items that I highlight, that advocating for a particular version. I can tell you that when I was working in the US government, there's been a number, actually before I worked in the US government, there's been a number of policy reports that have been put out there. And one of the things that have been highlighted is that in the context of dealing with religious voices is that, for example, Sufism is the sole solution to engage with individuals who can offer an alternative pathway out of extremism. I think Sufism is one approach, but it's not the singular approach. As I mentioned and highlighted, Salafism or post-Salafist group are uniquely important. Certainly, we know Shia entities, as I mentioned, other African traditional religions as well. Last thing I'll say to you, and I think this is within, that was highlighted by, from my colleague as well earlier, is this is this is my recent book that talks about community resilience. And I think this is really important as we look at the issue of how do you engage communities who have legitimate frustrations. I was just on a call earlier, and I point to you all to, if you haven't already seen it, it's a few years old, the report by the UN called Journey in and Out of Extremism. And in this report, it really highlighted some interesting points as it relates to why people were radicalized and then ultimately mobilized. Very different of individual being radicalized and then the pathway to mobilization. Historically, going back 10 years ago, that radicalization and mobilization might take, it could take upwards of 3, could be 5 years. Now I've seen it as short as 2 years, and with the advent of technology and online connectivity, it can be even shorter. But what I would say that from that report from the UN that I think is quite helpful and important, that many of the responses of why people joined extremist movement, it was a reaction by the government. It'd be quite interesting in the context we are dealing with right now, and I'm sure my colleagues can speak to this much better than I can with the whole SARS event that we're seeing in Nigeria, of radicalization going in many different forms, right? It doesn't have to always be religious or ideological form extremism that we've seen manifested in various groups like ISWAP or in Al-Shabaab, et cetera, but also how our communities responding effectively. I'll stop there. I think we'll have much more engagement for the Q&A. I think I'm probably right at 15 minutes, if not slightly over. I hope I met it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fraser Rahim. They're giving us a lot of food for thought from the hybrid nature of countering violent extremism to the multiplicity of framing, and also, of course, that the state matters when we discuss issues of countering violent extremism. And hopefully we'll have the opportunity to return to some of those slides that you did not have the time to sort of speak to. I want to turn my attention to Dr. Audra Grant, who is our second speaker. Dr. Audra is the senior research manager at the NORC, a major social research organization at the University of Chicago, and also a senior political scientist at RAND. Her research focuses on the Middle East and Africa, as well as issues related to the development of political Islam, terrorism, as well as the attitudinal orientations of Middle East and African publics. She spent 5 years as an expert analyst at the US Department of State, specifically at the Bureau of Intelligence. Dr. Audra Grant, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Danielle. I'm just going to speak this morning, and my discussion actually today is going to address women within the context of strategies that integrate religion as a means of countering violent extremism. So I appreciate that you all are also going to deal with this issue in future discussions, and I hope that my talk today speaks to some of the things that you're concerned about. According to the United Nations, there are 33,000 Africans who have lost their lives to violent extremism. And in a relief web study of 18 African countries, estimates there suggest that countries have lost up to $97 billion in informal revenue since 2007. Those losses are staggering and indeed serious. There's been growing recognition that security-centric approaches to violent extremism are not sufficient for sustainable and effective solutions in Africa or elsewhere for that matter. Reliance solely on law enforcement and military responses do little to sustainably address the very local factors that create a permissive environment for violent extremism. Those factors include ideologies, grievances, lack of economic opportunity, community disintegration, and other micro conditions that mobilize individuals and groups and create fragilities. Strategies that do take these things into consideration are more effective. Important entry points for violent extremist organizations are local communities that have been beset by prolonged and long-standing conflict and poor socioeconomic conditions. A look at events in the communities of the Liptako-Goma region in the Sahel and in northern Mozambique are illustrative here. Given the centrality of local conditions, community resilience looms large, as Dr. Fraser just said, and in this context, as does the role of women in countering violent extremism. Community resilience, we say, usually refers to how communities adopt the norms, strategies, and processes required to respond to shocks, be those shocks political, economic, or environmental, in order to recover, prevent, or blunt their impacts. In this case, we're talking about violence. Women are more likely than others to be adversely affected by armed conflict and are increasingly targeted by combatants and armed actors from extremist organizations and other armed groups. For instance, women and girls are affected by gender-based violence, subjected to murder, sexual slavery, forced pregnancy, and forced sterilization. They are disproportionately targeted by violent actors. Moreover, violent extremist groups attack the educational, social, and economic opportunities for women and girls, but this would paint in a unidimensional picture of women's interaction with VE settings, as women actually have varied roles dependent on how they're affected by violent extremism. The roles of women are varied and both complex. As mentioned earlier, women can be victims of violent extremism, but they also may be perpetrators, as we've seen from Boko Haram, which has used more female suicide bombers than any other violent extremist organization. This is far less common, but I bring this up because women's involvement underscores the potential of women and girls in advancing terrorist groups' missions, just like men. In Cote d'Ivoire, for example, women play roles as cooks and facilitators. In addition, women may be peacemakers and make significant contributions to countering violent extremism. And this is a role that's perhaps underappreciated and underutilized by policymakers and practitioners. Women can play critical roles in peace and security efforts, including conflict resolution and peace building. Yet the roles of women in relation to violent extremism have remained less explored and not fully harnessed by policymakers and practitioners. This dearth of understanding is particularly notable as the impact of armed conflict on women may be further exacerbated by terrorist and violent extremist groups operating in conflict-affected areas and vice versa. USAID's, or using USAID's conceptualization, the presence of institutions, resources, and adaptive facilitators are key. In this respect, women are important both as a resource and as facilitators of peace, and are thus critical actors in countering violent extremism efforts. Representing as many as half of the populations in conflict-affected settings in Africa, as mothers, heads of households, and providers, women are cornerstones of efforts to address conflict, extremism, and all kinds of violence. Indeed, the UN incorporates roles of women in peace and conflict through UN Security Council Resolution 1325 and other resolutions on women, peace, and security. This gender dimension has been less visible in CVE discussions, however, and there have been very few opportunities for CVE practitioners and policymakers to actually interact directly with civil society actors who are confronting these issues in the field. However, a recent UN report on women in peace and security includes a call to action on this front, stating that the Security Council should, quote, include women in peace and security issues in all thematic debates, such as those related to terrorism, counterterrorism measures, transnational organized crime, and conflict prevention and management of natural resources. This point was further underscored by Resolution 2122, in which the Council expressed its intention to increase its attention to women, peace, and security issues in all relevant thematic areas, including threats to peace and security caused by terrorist acts. Women as sisters, wives, mothers, and caregivers, as Michelle Grossman notes in her research, are valuable participants in CVE efforts. They can influence the way youth interpret and respond to extremist narratives by shaping the views of youth. She also finds that women can see behaviors that might suggest when and how young people are being radicalized. Women, she finds, are also often considered first responders in the sense that they are among the first to be notified when youth are in trouble, and can therefore be a frontline support system available to youth that can confront adversity, very complex situations, and competing influences. In these roles, women can also be educators, mentors, models of emulation, and teachers, being close to families and communities, and because of the role that they have in families and communities. In another pattern that we see, there can also be a lack of strong father figures in communities. And here, women can also get involved in helping young men who might be prone to getting involved in drugs and illicit activities. Mothers and women can be involved in resolving issues, but one of the challenges that they face is that the persistence of traditional norms and structures shaped by patriarchy tend to relegate women to the private sphere. In interacting with state security forces, however, women may be effective in interacting with state actors because they are less likely to be seen by a threat compared to young men who are viewed with more suspicion and who also, frankly, might be just more afraid in their interactions with law enforcement officials and state agents. An interesting case study that I'd like to share with you in the region is that of Morocco. Morocco has made interesting and significant progress with incorporating women and religion in its efforts to counter violent extremism. And for those of you who know a little bit about Morocco, it's no stranger to violent extremism, having sustained attacks in 2003, 2007, and 2011, and was also a source of foreign fighters. Morocco has involved women in encountering violent extremism efforts through strategies that consider both religious and traditional norms in efforts to tackle radicalization. Efforts have also included strategies that have not directly involved religion, which is also very important, as Dr. Fraser also pointed out. So this first strategy involves revision of what's called the personal status codes, or the Mudawwana. Morocco revised those codes in 2004, addressing women's access to divorce, inheritance, child custody, and alimony, raising the age of marriage to 18. It also instituted restrictions on polygamy and also improved the opportunities for women in sharing property in marriage. The revisions have improved the status of women, empowering their voices economically and politically among communities and within families, thereby enhancing their ability to also more effectively address violent extremism. Also, Morocco in 2005 launched a program to train female imams, also called Murashidat, to promote tolerant interpretation of Islam in communities. It's an innovative program. It's a very interesting program. According to some work on this done by the Brookings Institution, the program began with a modest training of about 50 women. And by 2015, 2016, they had 500 women, and that number has increased even further. But during that period, that was a 1,000% increase, and that's significant. These women work in key nodes of radicalization, including prisons, villages, and in key cities, working among urban youth. The imamas, who have the same training as their male counterparts, teach Maliki Islam, which is influenced by Sufism, to promote messages of peace, tolerance, and acceptance among youth as well as women. They teach women how to read and write. They help women address radicalization in family and in communities, and also link women with doctors to address health issues. The thing is that there's very little data, again, another point that Dr. Fraser pointed out, on how effective these programs are. And so more monitoring and evaluation in this area would indeed be very welcome to understand the intricacies and the nuances of these types of programs. But it is an example of how both women and religion and non-religious strategies can be used to counter violent extremism. But again, there are challenges for Morocco, but also other countries as well. There are those traditional and religious norms that tend to place women in this private sphere and create a reluctance for women to speak publicly about extremism. Normative change and innovation is important in this regard. Also, a lot of CVE strategies tend to focus on male youth. There's a dearth of research on the unique impacts of women and the contributions of girls as well. The Global Counterterrorism Forum and other practitioners and researchers offer a range of good practices in incorporating women in CVE efforts that also build resilience. One of them includes understanding the multidimensional roles of women and girls in CVE at the local level. This is absolutely critical. Also important is engaging men and boys in preventive strategies and responses, and in facilitating women's participation in CVE. I've done some work on other issues related to gender-based violence, and one of them was corporal punishment. And although this is not related to violence, what we have found is in dealing with issues where women are vulnerable to violence, it's very important to engage women and boys in preventive strategies and interventions, and this is no exception. At the same time, it's important to ensure the safety of girls and women that are involved in countering violent extremism activities. It's important to use local community-informed approaches, Africa-centric approaches, to minimize the risk that might be presented to women's personal safety and negative community responses, but also to contribute to effective outcomes as well. It's also important to build the capacity of women and girls to participate safely in these kinds of activities. The role of women in communities might also be enhanced, and also enhanced within families, as this example of Morocco demonstrated. It's also important to build the capacity of CSOs and the role of women in CSOs to build educational awareness and to be able to talk about issues related to human rights, tolerance, civic responsibility, and community responsibility. Also, it's important to understand the gender dynamics of radicalization. We still don't understand the full range and the full complexity of the impacts of radicalization on women and girls vis-a-vis boys and men. We need to build evidence-based approaches that lead to effective strategies that prevent women and girls from participating in violent extremism, but also how to understand their roles in countering violent extremism. We need to do more work on understanding the specific push and pull factors for women and girls joining VEOs, their roles as well as their coping strategies. And finally, there needs to be more monitoring and evaluation of programs and policies. And also we need to include gender monitoring of policies, practices, processes, interventions, and the like in order to understand the differentiated impacts of violent extremism on women versus girls. And so with that, I think my time is up as well, and I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Audra Grant, for that presentation and for drawing our attention to the invaluable role of women, and to tell us that this is much more complex than we tend to assume. We tend to look at women as victims, but we know they can be perpetrators, but more importantly, they can be peacemakers as well. But also, following on what Dr. Fraser Rahim has said about community resilience and the need to build in local initiative into how we sort of enact policies related to preventing and countering violent extremism. I will turn now to our next speaker, Abdul Basit Kassim, who is a PhD candidate in religion, at Rice University and a visiting doctoral fellow at the Institute of Islamic Thought in Africa at Northwestern University. His research focuses on African intellectual history with emphasis on Islam in Central and Western Sudanic Africa, history of Islamic thought, African and African diaspora religions, Arabic Ajami codicology and textual anthropology, Africology and postcolonial studies, Islam and race in African diaspora, gender and sexuality in Muslim societies, and religion in international relations. So quite a diverse field of interest. His first book, The Boko Haram Reader, From Nigerian Preachers to the Islamic State, which is published by Oxford University Press and co-edited with Michael Nwakpa, offers an unprecedented collection of primary source text, audio visuals, and nasheeds, martial hymns translated into English from Hausa, Arabic, and Kanuri. The book traces the history and evolution of the Boko Haram movement in northeastern Nigeria and by extension, the Lake Chad Basin. Looking forward to your presentation, Kasim, and the floor is yours.
I believe he dropped off.
Did we all drop off?
No, just the next speaker dropped off. I think we might need to go to the following speaker.
Sorry, my screen has seemed to have done something funny. Has everybody else's screen still looked the same?
I can't see anybody. I just
Yeah, I also can't see anybody now. Oh,
Okay, there we go.
No, I can't.
if I put on my video, then I can see everybody again, but
Previously, nobody had a video on. That's why we didn't have a visual.
I couldn't even see I was able to see the gallery. I don't know.
It's normal now.
Okay.
It is normal now. Okay,
Yes,
good.
Yes.
So Daniel, do you want to, let's see.
Yes, I think we.
Yeah.
I think we can go on to Professor Darren Keel and give Abdul Basit Kasim the time to come back in. Okay, so then we'll turn to Professor Keel, who is an associate professor in the Department of Conflict Resolution, Human Security, and Global Governance at McCormack Graduate School, University of Massachusetts in Boston. He's also Executive Director of the Center for Peace, Democracy, and Development. Professor Keel has research expertise in civil society, international security, crisis intervention, and culture and religion in Africa with specific focus on Nigeria. He's also worked on issues related to culture and religion, international negotiation, and nation building. And with that, I'll pass it on to Professor Keel for your presentation.
Okay, thank you, Daniel, and my thanks to you and to Krista and to all the organizers for inviting me to join. And Daniel, an apology for not getting you the abstract in time. You haven't had a chance to see some of my comments yet, so thank you for your patience. I'm going to just share my screen here briefly, just to show a couple of PowerPoints here real quick. Let's see. Can everyone see that?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Okay, so much of my work has been in Nigeria and focused particularly on Muslim-Christian dialogue, but also intra-religious dialogue. And much of that has been in Kaduna, though I've done research on Boko Haram in Borno State and other parts of Nigeria, and done a lot of work on the Niger Delta militias as well. So I've done a lot of work all across Nigeria in different areas. I'm going to focus, I think, much of the conversation on Boko Haram and ISWAP, the Islamic State West Africa province, which Boko Haram, at least part of it, evolved into. But I want to at least underscore something that Mohammed said earlier in his presentation as well. I think is that you know, there are also Christian militias and Christian fundamentalist movements that have gotten violent as well. They're not as organized or as, so far at least, deadly as some of the Islamist groups in Nigeria have been. And I'm not going to talk about them in this presentation, but I think it should be a part of our conversation and something we need to keep in mind. So the other thing in terms of thinking about sort of the drivers of violent extremism in Nigeria and in other parts of Africa, I think, you know, oftentimes we tend to focus in on the systemic drivers, and they get a lot of attention in our conversation, and rightly so. We're talking about poverty, corruption, youth unemployment, and just in general sort of elements of state failure. The lack of service delivery and as part of state failure, the resort of the state to violence in terms of you know, in terms of radicalizing groups. And that last piece I want to say quite a bit about a little bit later. You know, and for sure, this is something when you ask religious groups themselves or religious leaders, you know, what is the role of religion in violent extremism? They're going to give you, at least I've found at least, a lot of the religious leaders say, well, it's not really about religion. It's all about these other things. Religion is just a fig leaf, you know, for poverty or for state failure and so on and so forth. And I think there's some truth to that, but I really want to argue in this presentation that we need to focus on the religious dimension itself, that it's very, very important in understanding violent extremism, what the beliefs are in the groups in question, and that if we're going to be trying to reverse or undermine violent extremism, an important chunk of that battle is in the realm of beliefs. And that engaging those in some way, shape, or form has to be a part of sort of a de-escalation strategy. In addition, but I think in order to sort of to bring this out, I want to contrast a little bit the Boko Haram to some of the Niger Delta militias in terms of their varying agendas, and to underscore this point about the engaging the belief dimension. Because Boko Haram is not just another group that's interested in resource control, and I don't mean to reduce the Niger Delta militias simply to that, but to say that you know, that the leaders of the group are true believers, and that the religious vision that they have is an essential piece of this, but it's also an important part of motivating the groups. Now, let me see here. I have okay. Much of my work has been influenced by working with peacemakers, like folks may be aware of the Interfaith Mediation Center in Kaduna, Pastor James and Imam Shafa, individuals who've been working across the religious divide to try to build many of these bridges. And I think a lot of my comments and toward the end will be influenced by experiences working with these folks. The centrality of religious beliefs. I think that, you know, if I were to sort of sum up what these elements are, and then I'm going to fill in a little bit more, you know, from sort of the example of Boko Haram in a minute, to say that, you know, why is it that religion plays such seems to be so connected to violent extremism? I think there are a few sort of common elements, and I want to use a bit of negotiation theory here to sort of back up, you know, sort of why these tend to lead to violence. I mean, first and foremost, and there's been a lot of thought about this, of course, you know, that religion, particularly religious extremist groups, tend to have this utopian vision. And I will go a little bit more into Boko Haram's perspective on that in a second. But the utopian vision is of course, a central piece of this for religious extremists worldwide, some sort of sense of a perfect world that is to be achieved. And the method of achieving it is often expansionist, in the sense that it's not only sort of protecting one's world, but it's actually, you know, expanding this sense of the utopia to other parts of the religious in-group, or even to expand it to other religious groups, to convert forcibly others that are out there. A third point about sort of why religious beliefs are so conflict prone is the collectivist nature of the beliefs. And by that, I'm talking about the the cohesiveness of the in-group, the importance of sticking together, and that we are not just individuals, we are members of a larger group. And this sort of collective perspective keeps people together and also hardens perspectives from a negotiation point of view. And then last and not surprising is the divine mandate that is often part of extremist groups, because God wills it, makes it extremely difficult. So all four of these points together make it extremely difficult to negotiate with groups that have this perspective. And to some extent that may seem obvious, but think about it in terms of how the groups rise and then also how groups de-escalate, is that these groups don't have a lot of room themselves to find ways to sort of to coexist with other groups or to bring across their goals and objectives in some sort of peaceable fashion. So the non-negotiability of that is a key thing to think about. Second is, I want to argue from sort of escalation, from an escalation perspective, that the religious beliefs of extremist groups also make it very hard to de-escalate conflict once it's gotten started, and make it quicker for escalation as well. And this is in part because many of these groups together are predicting the escalation to come. They have a theology or a prophecy around what the future holds as they're bringing about their utopian vision, and the prophecy involves some sense of violence or combat. And so consequently, when escalation comes, it's welcomed. It's seen as part of the process. It's something that was prophesized, predicted, and so on. And so consequently, these groups are ready when it comes, and then it's also very difficult to get out of the escalation dynamic once you're in it. And I would connect all of these together as well into an identity dimension, is that the centrality of the utopian vision, all these sorts of elements I've just laid out become a key part of personal identity and who you are. And changing that sort of identity dimension is a long road, and it's extremely difficult from a policy perspective to try to impact identity. The sort of dialogue workshops that we do on the ground, the interfaith stuff and the intrafaith stuff that we do, it tries to target exactly those sorts of things, but it's extremely labor intensive. It's hard to get thousands of people through dialogue processes in a short period of time. So thinking about that is important. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen there. Okay. All right, so let me just sort of fill in a little bit more some of those points I made, and I'd like to contrast sort of Boko Haram and the Niger Delta militias as sort of an important contrast point. So the founder of Boko Haram, Mohammed Yusuf, definitely sort of put together a utopian vision, and it'll sound similar to other sort of neo-Wahhabist groups, worldwide, modeled on sort of a vision of Islam's golden age during the period of the Prophet Muhammad and his immediate successors. So it's a medievalist vision of returning back to sort of a lost perfection or a time when people lived correctly. So it's got an orientation towards deconstructing Nigeria. It's not a forward-looking; it's more of a backward-looking vision. And so Nigeria needs, from this perspective, to be deconstructed, to taken apart. And the proper, Sharia-based structures need to be put back in place. But it's not just a Sharia law. There's also a sort of medieval notion of culture and customs that need to be implemented in this. I think it's important to note that sort of the roots of Boko Haram were a hijra group, sort of a utopian community that went off into the countryside to try to create their own perfect world outside of the Nigerian state, outside of the world. And initially, I mean, there's some debate about this, but at least the research I've done, I think it's pretty clear that early on, although there was a very robust debate about the role of violence, Boko Haram did not necessarily start as a violent group, and I don't think it was destined to head down that road. A critical part of what made Boko Haram violent was violence of the state and state oppression that happened towards the group as they were living in these isolated communities. Initially the governors that were there, but then later the police and then the military cracking down on these groups definitely were a critical part of igniting this sort of violent vision. But the utopian vision being an important part of this, and sort of this critique of the corrupt Western state, and the Boko and Boko Haram is often translated as Western education, but I think it's really a broader sense of sort of an attack on the Westernized elite that had that have mismanaged Nigeria. Now contrast that to sort of the Niger Delta groups, which have a self-determination agenda and have sort of a modernist state approach, and a sort of a forward-looking vision of building a Niger Delta that is very modern, based, with a strong oil industry and so on. So that's a different kind of vision to work with than sort of a more sort of backward-looking, or at least historical-looking vision of Boko Haram. But they do share, note that there's a common critique of the corrupt state, and the failure of the elite of Nigeria to run the country properly. But note that there's no critique of Westernism in that, and that's a really important sort of distinction between those two. I mentioned expansionist as an important part of this. Boko Haram has an expansionist ideology, particularly trying to capture northern Nigeria and sort of the Muslim majority lands, but also certainly interested in expanding into the south if possible. So there's a sort of a limitless extension of the vision that certainly creates a strong inclination towards the use of violence, which is different than sort of the ethnic separatist movements of the Niger Delta, which are seeking to just protect a defined point of land, which is aggressive, but is not in the same way. I'm running out of time, so let me just sort of quickly go through a few of these other points. The collectivist notions in Boko Haram, this notion that we're into this together as sort of based on visions of the ulama, it makes it extremely difficult for individuals to step out away from sort of the collective. And again, from a negotiation perspective, my inability as an individual to sort of to simply come up with some sort of alternative arrangement for myself means that I am stuck in with the main trend. And so long as the main trend continues in the violent direction, this is much more difficult. And in the Niger Delta, the individual factor has been far more prevalent, which has allowed different groups to come to different settlements. I think the point about being mandated by God, I think is pretty straightforward. How difficult it is to negotiate God's mandate, if that's your perspective on things. And then the impact that this has on identity. Let me just, since I'm running out of time, let me just say here quickly about the escalation dynamic. I mean, think about sort of how the fact that these movements, and Boko Haram in particular, predict this kind of, this sort of cataclysmic battle, and the embrace of that. And then, of course, if you see the ideology of suicide bombers, fitting into this notion, how easy it is to escalate with that sort of perspective, and how difficult it is to then de-escalate, and how once things start to escalate, this must continue down the path that has been predicted. Let me just end by talking about that, the system environment is not irrelevant. I don't mean to suggest that at all. In Boko Haram, for instance, gives fighters, seeds for planting a chunk of land, and also gives them wives. So in terms of sort of social and economic supports, there have been elements of that, policy component to Boko Haram that is central to sort of, to winding down the impact of the movement. But I really feel like talking about these sorts of beliefs and engaging these movements in the belief dimension is a central part to not only understanding, but also trying to undermine these groups, and to either bring important components of the group back into a nonviolent arrangement, or at least into some other sort of way of life, which means we have to think about how do you create a similarly attractive vision? I mean, particularly for young people, but also for folks who live with the state failure in Nigeria. What are some other attractive vision that's possible? And there are debates within Islam in Nigeria that could be amplified. There are many sort of moderate Islamic scholars out there that have some very important peace-based visions for social justice. And I mentioned some of the interfaith groups that are talked about, and maybe in in the question and answer session, maybe we can get into that a little bit more deeply, and the role that particularly intra-faith dialogue can play in trying to wind these back. But let me stop there and thank you again.
Thank you so much, Professor Q, for that stimulating discussion. Obviously, the role of beliefs remains at the very core of de-escalation, as you have emphasized there, and also the need as well to focus a little bit on the role of interfaith groups and providing an alternative vision that is attractive enough for young people in Nigeria today. And we know that just from the NSAS movement that the role of the state continues to matter in why youth protest. And so that remains front and center across all the presentations so far. I want to turn my attention to Abdul Basit Kasim, who is a PhD candidate in religion at Rice University. As I mentioned earlier, a visiting doctoral fellow at the Institute of Islamic Thought in Africa at Northwestern University. And Abdul Basit Kasim's research mostly focuses on African intellectual history, with particular emphasis on Islam in Central and Western Sudanic Africa. His work is particularly authoritative in the field of Islamist Salafi jihadist group in northeastern Nigeria and more broadly the Lake Chad Basin. Particularly his book, The Boko Haram Reader, which was co-edited with Michael Mwapa, traces the history and evolution of the Boko Haram movement and particularly uses remarkable textual anthropological skills to try to map the history, the evolution and mutation of these groups. I'll turn the floor to Abdul Basit Kasim to sort of illuminate the role of religion particularly in Nigeria.
So thank you, Dr. Biba, for the invitation to participate in this conference. And I'm sorry, the other time my laptop just shut down. I'm really sorry about that. So today I will be making a presentation on, the title of my presentation is actually Embodying the Saved Sect. But basically I'll be looking at I'll be mapping the different ideological contours of some of the violent extremist movements in Africa. Now, to start with, it's actually very important for us to understand that the violent extremist movements, they actually did not emerge out of a vacuum. There's a context that bettered this movement. And it's also very important for us also to understand that this movement, although the focus has often been on Islamic movements, it's a violent extremist movement. They actually cut across a different religion. So, for example, in Nigeria, in a place like Kaduna State, for example, we have some violent extremist movement that actually aligned along the Christian theology. So we have a group, for example, called Akwatapo in Kaduna State. So different scholars have actually developed different typologies for understanding the evolution of violent extremist movements. Some scholars focus on religious doctrines. Other scholars argue that it's poverty and inequality. Some other scholars actually look at the political context within the African countries that enabled the evolution of the violent extremist movement. Some other scholars look at the question of personal agency, because irrespective of religious doctrine, poverty, there's still a question of why do certain individuals embark upon the path of violent extremism. And then other scholars also look at the question of the geographical and international context and the flow of transnational ideas from the metropole to the satellite, if we can use those terms. But for me, my research has often focused on religious doctrine. Now, when you're looking at religious doctrine, and especially the ideology of Boko Haram, many people ask the question, is Boko Haram idea really new? Like when many people see Boko Haram, especially what the ideas they espouse and the project to the public, there's always that question of, oh, we've not seen some of these ideas before. Actually, there's a lot of historical convergence in the emergence of this group, in the sense that some of those groups, they actually espouse some ideas that we've seen in the past in the evolution of Islamic intellectual history in Africa. So I would take the example of Northern Nigeria, for example. So since the 11th century, when the ruling elite of Borno Empire declared Islam as the state religion, Muslim elites, Muslim scholars, as well as ordinary Muslims have grappled with the following questions. Some of these questions are, what does it mean to be a Muslim? What exactly does it mean to be Muslim? When does a Muslim become an apostate or an infidel? So one of the central core ideology of Boko Haram, not just Boko Haram, even Ansarudin, JNIM, Ansar al-Islam in Burkina Faso, as well as so many other movements in the Sahel, one of their central ideologies is the question of takfir, which is the question of excommunication. When exactly is it permissible to declare other Muslims as infidel or as apostates that do not, because the moment you declare a group of people to be infidel or apostate, then you legitimize their killing. You legitimize their killing. And that is why, for example, Boko Haram actually carry out attack in mosques, even in places where there are other fellow Muslims, because they do not see those people there as belonging to the faith anymore. So the question of what does it mean to be a Muslim, and when exactly does a Muslim become an apostate or an infidel, this particular debate has been central to the evolution of jihadi movement, both in the past and present of African society. I mean, in the past, in the 18th, 17th, 19th century, we saw this debate, the way it unfolded and the way it actually bettered some of the jihad movements, including the one of Danfodio, including the one of Al-Hajj Umar Tal al-Futi. In some of their texts, you will see there's a lot of discourse about what it means to be a Muslim. And today we are seeing that the repetition of that same ideology. So there've also been the debate about what creeds should Muslim embrace as the authentic interpretation of Islam. So in Islamic theology, this question is often revolved around the issue of al-aqaid sahiha. So what creed should Muslim embrace? So there are plethora of Islamic creeds. I mean, the mainstream that people are very familiar with is the question of Salafism, Shiism, Sufism. But there's so many other sectarian orientation as well. And there've been a lot of debate about the question of which of this sectarian orientation constitutes the authentic interpretation of Islam. So if we look at some of the violent extremist movements, they always have this notion that they are holding upon the authentic interpretation of Islam, and they often establish this position of their position on the whole concept of safe sects. So in Islam, there's this famous hadith of the Prophet where the Prophet actually said that the Muslim community will be divided into 73 sects, and one of those sects is the sect that is considered safe sect. In Islamic theology, is also called Firqat al-Najiyah. So some of the violent extremist movement, they always portray themselves as, oh, we are the Ghuraba, we are the strangers, we are the one fighting for God, for the revival of God's law on earth. We are the one fighting to bring back the Akimiyah of God. So they always have that notion as well. Then there've also been debate about what exactly constitutes Iman, that's what constitutes belief, what constitutes unbelief, what constitutes innovation in religious matters, what constitutes bid'ah. There've also been debate about what constitutes tawheed, what constitutes so tawheed is Islamic is monotheism. So there've been debates about what constitutes monotheism. There've been debates about what constitutes polytheism. There've also been debates about what constitutes the pillars and nullifiers of Islam. In Islamic theology, I mean, this is called Arkan al-Islam wa Nawaqid al-Islam. So some of these violent extremist movements, in their theological discourse, they often argue that whoever does not hold whoever does not embrace their theological interpretation of Islam, such people or group of people have Yakhruju an millat Islam. Their Islam is nullified, so therefore they're no longer Muslim. And then there've also been debates about what constitutes halal and haram, what constitutes lawful and unlawful action, what constitutes, how should Muslims command what is right and forbid what is wrong. Now, one of the central theological principles in Islam is this whole concept of al-amr bil ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar, which is commanding what is right and forbidding what is wrong. This notion has been interpreted differently. It has been interpreted from a pacifist perspective to a more radical and violent perspective. And then there's also been this notion of this debate about how should Muslims relate to people of other faiths. Now, this notion is actually central. I mean, this whole idea it revolves around the theological principle of al-wala wal-bara'a. So if you look at some of the ideological tenets of violent extremist movements across different regions of Africa, they always have this notion that Muslims have to completely disavow themselves from having religious or economic or interreligious dialogue or relation with people of other faiths. And then there's also been the whole question or debate around the position of Islam on territoriality. And this debate actually started for example, in Nigeria, it started way back in 1903 when the British actually colonized northern Nigeria. Some of the Muslim scholars at that time, they had to discuss on the Islamic status of Nigeria now that it has been colonized. Some scholars at that time argue that the colonization of Nigeria has actually rendered the country to be what is known in Islamic theology as Darul Kufr, like the land of unbelief or the land of war. And since that period, they've actually been that idealized notion, that utopian notion that Muslims have to struggle and establish Darul Islam, where the Sharia, the Islamic law or God's law will actually reign supreme. So if you look at some of the violent extremist movement, as part of their ideological repertoire, they always have this old notion that they are the ones fighting to revive this territoriality where Sharia in their own understanding will actually be implemented unhindered by secular inhibitions. There's also been the whole conversation around what constitutes an Islamic state or caliphate, Dawla Islamiyya or Fiqh Khilafah, and then the whole question of around Imama or Siyasat to Sharia. So for example, some of the Islamist violent extremist movements, they've upheld the notion that democracy and other secular political systems do not conform with the notion of Islam. And there's been a lot of debate around what constitutes a just political authority and the relationship of Muslims to political authority, and at what point is it permissible or impermissible for Muslims to actually rebel against their political leaders. Now, what we've seen over time is that some Islamic movements, they've been able to reconcile their political theology, and they've been able to accommodate modern political concepts like liberty, freedom of religion, as well as democracy. They've been able to accommodate it into their political theology. But then there are other movements, like especially the violent extremist movement, who insist that that the modern political concepts do not conform with Islamic theology, and therefore there's no any form of reconciliation of thought. And then there've also been this whole debate around what constitutes legitimate and illegitimate jihad or warfare. Jihad, Boko Haram is not the first group that will actually fight jihad in northern Nigeria. Neither is JNIM the first group that will actually fight jihad in the Sahel. Neither is AQIM the first group that will actually fight jihad in Algeria. in all of these regions, we've had series of successive waves we've had actually successive waves of reform, of Islamization, of counter-reform, of dissidence, of rebellion, of jihad. And one thing we've seen is in the contemporary, in the ideological repertoire of the contemporary Islamic movement, they are very smart in the way they mobilize historical narrative to give legitimacy to their own projects. So what they do, they always present themselves as the heir and the inheritors of some of the Muslim reformers back in the 18th, 19th centuries. And we have to understand that the memories and the legacies of some of these past reformers, they are highly revered, they're highly cherished within the African Muslim milieu. So looking back to this history and then presenting the violent movement that I look back to this history and trying to present themselves as inheritor of this movement, it's become so hard to then delegitimize them, because now, for example, if you look at Boko Haram and say that, well, Boko Haram, they declare other Muslims as infidels, so therefore they are not Islamic. But Danfodio also declared other Muslims as infidels during his time. Umar al-Futi also declared other people as other Muslims as infidel during his time. Now, the problem most people have been facing is because the memory or the legacy of people like Danfodio, Umar al-Futi is so revered within the African Muslim milieu, people are so scared to have that conversation. Because the moment you have that conversation, or the moment you want to critique Boko Haram, then automatically it means you also have to critique what Danfodio did or what Umar al-Futi did, and people are really not prepared for that conversation. And then lastly, there've also been that whole conversation around how compatible or incompatible is the idea of the nation state with Islam, the nation of secular constitution. In Arabic, this is called a dastur wa qawanina wadaiya. And then as Muslim society actually evolved, there've also been that challenges of how to respond, how Muslims should respond to the challenges of modernity and the rapidly evolving social transformations, which are actually shaping daily conduct of religious life. Now, as Muslims, whether in northern Nigeria or in Mali or in Senegal or in Algeria or in Egypt, as Muslims actually grapple with some of these questions, now they go back and actually draw from a rich heritage of writings, textual practices, legal treatises, discursive productions, and doctrinal interpretations written by Muslim scholars and jurists in Central Sudanic Africa, Central and Western Sudanic Africa, as well as the wider Muslim world. And usually the responses to all of these questions I outlined, question about political authority, question about how Muslims should relate with other people of other faiths, question about who should be declared a Muslim or who should be excommunicated and declared as infidel or apostate. Now, as Muslims grapple with this question, they develop different projects of reform. Now, some of this projects of reform have actually been non-violent. Some of it, now, they've actually been three stages of I call it three stages of evolution of reformist idea. The first phase is usually the phase where some movements actually develop ideas about Islamic reform, but then they keep it at that level, non-violence. Now, some other movements, they move from just preaching reform to the stage of dissidence. So the stage of dissidence is where movements begin to develop, take political position, as well as opposing the status quo or the norm. And then some other movements proceed from dissidence to the level of actual rebellion. Now, in contemporary time, Boko Haram is the only movement within the northern Nigerian sphere that have been able to move from calling for reform to dissidence to rebellion. Other movements like Izala, for example, they only stopped at reform. Some other movements like JTI, Jamaatul Tajdid al-Islam, they moved from reform to dissidence. But then when the Nigerian government confronted this movement with punitive measure, they returned back, they left the level of the stage of dissidence and returned back to the proselytism of reform alone. So lastly, what we look at now, looking at all of these ideas, how have some movements responded on the ground? And I would love to speak about a particular movement, a particular Islamic organization that have actually been doing a lot of work on the ground. And this particular organization is known as the Dawah Institute of Nigeria. So Dawah Institute of Nigeria was founded by Sheikh Ahmed Lemu in Mina, in Niger State. And this particular organization, they've been engaging in a lot of CVE programs in Nigeria, as well as in Kenya and in other regions of Africa. Now, what I found very inspiring about their own program is this particular organization, they created what is known as BRAVE. So BRAVE is their own CVE program. They call it BRAVE, Building Resilience Against Violent Extremism. Now, what they did in their program, they divide the population into two categories. Now, the first categories are the people they call the religious gatekeepers. Now, the religious gatekeepers consist of people like imams, like clerics, like dawah activists, that's religious activists, religious leaders, academics who are teaching religion in tertiary institution and higher education, youth leaders, community influencers, women leaders, traditional rulers, as well as other stakeholders. Now, they identify these religious gatekeepers and they try to give them certain training. Now, the other category are the recruitment field. Now, this is the field of the general public, and it includes young like the youth population, as well as students, students across all educational level. Now, the training they give to the religious gatekeeper, they actually train the religious gatekeeper on faith-based critical thinking tools. So they come up with some toolkits to explain to the religious gatekeepers how to develop critical thinking tools from a religious perspective. So they teach them courses on usul al-fiqh, which is Islamic jurisprudence, courses on qawaid al-fiqhiyya, which is Islamic legal philosophy and maxims, and then also courses on maqasid sharia, which is the purpose of Islamic law. They try to build their capacity along this line. Another thing they also do as well, they also prepare these religious gatekeepers by training them on counter and alternative narrative. So, for example, they will bring some arguments of Boko Haram that, okay, if Boko Haram members actually present this ideology or present this idea that the current Nigerian state is a kufr state, is a state of unbelief, because either the president is not ruling with the Sharia, because the president is ruling with secular constitution, how will you counter such an idea? And then they train some of these religious gatekeepers on how to respond to some of this idea. Another thing they also do as well, they also try as well to train them on realistic alternative to violence. So they try they give these religious gatekeepers, they train them on how, if they meet, should they come in contact with Boko Haram members or people who are sympathizers of Boko Haram ideology, how they can shape their orientation towards following alternative path to violence, like how they can actually engage in community service or in other path that is different from violence. Now, another thing they do, which is also very important, is they also train them on leadership and management skills as well. How they can be more effective in the community, how they can make themselves to be more responsive to the needs and the demands of their community. And then so they train them as well on ICT, on how to use ICT, because in some of these religious gatekeepers are not so they do not really have more knowledge of modern technology, but they try to train them on how to use modern technology and how to also use modern technology to find solutions to some of the problems they're confronting in their community. So this particular organization, Dawah Institute of Nigeria, I think I actually evaluated some of their programs, and I found that some of their programs to be really, really effective on the ground. And I've seen a lot of impact actually that have been going on the ground based on some of their activity. So in conclusion, what I would love to say is it's very, very important, as other panelists have argued, that we should take religious ideas seriously. It's very, very important. Most times when I see people trying to undermine or downplay religious idea, I feel it's reductionist, because when you look at and that is actually the major reason why I and my co-editor, why we worked on the Boko Haram reader. So the purpose of the Boko Haram reader is to present the ideas of Boko Haram out there so that people can understand the movement from their own words. Now, I think it's very important for us to avoid the secularizing tendency of understanding religious ideas or the ideas that people project from other material and class-based like Marxist-leaning interests. So for example, when people look at religious ideas, rather than taking the words of the people who profess those ideas for what it is and seeing things their way, they often try to impute that, oh no, it's probably poverty that is making this person speak this way. It's probably because he's in this social class, that's why he's speaking this way. But I think it's actually that is a secularizing tendency. I think it's very important for us to take religious ideas more seriously and actually look, because this religious ideas, they have a lot of implication on the ground. Boko Haram's declaration of an Islamic state or a caliphate was not out of a vacuum. They were playing a particular religious script, and that religious script, they try as much as possible to tie it into history. So if you look at when on 23rd of August 2014, when Shekau declared an Islamic state, one of the things Shekau said in his declaration is that, oh, ever since the Dawah of Danfodio was defeated by the British, ever since the British defeated, different movements have been coming up with different programs on how to resuscitate the Islamic State, but none of it have been successful, except now that they themselves have been successful. This is a very fundamental religious script that they actually play, and I think it's important that this set of ideas, we should take it and understand it from their own words, and not necessarily trying to impute our own interpretation or to them. I would love to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kasim, for that very exciting presentation. I think it complements what Professor Q presented earlier, especially the program you've worked with, the Dawah Institute in Nigeria, and seeking alternative vision, which Professor Q was sort of proposing there in his presentation. I think there are a few questions for our presenters, and I guess I just wanted to use my own position and ask a couple of questions, and then open it up. I think Wheeler is going to raise some of questions that some of you have asked in the chat box, and I want to encourage you to keep posting your questions, and we can pick it up and ask our presenters. I think a common theme that sort of runs through the presentation, one of which is the notion of resilience, is one that we have seen across the board from Dr. Fraser Rahim's presentation to Kasim's presentation. And I think close to that is also the role of the state as well when it comes to discussions of PCD. And I just want to pick up on, I think it's a general question to the panelists to ask, when we talk about resilience, obviously resilience is a concept itself that has a lot of history in psychology and tends to refer to the capacity of people to sort of bounce back from difficulty. How much of a policy that is embedded or based on resilience gives the state a sort of a free pass and puts the initiative on the communities who are facing the pressures of violent extremism, and how much of it does it, how much of our focus on community resilience undermines the role that the state continues to play, as we see, whether it was in the Boko Haram crisis or in the Niger Delta crisis, play in triggering a movement that started as peaceful and moving them towards whether that is dissidents and then finally to violent extremism. So just trying to balance the role of the community, the role of local communities, vis-a-vis the role of the state itself, and how we should understand that in this sort of framework of community resilience. Where does the state sort of fit in this whole sort of conversation? I think that's one of the first questions that I have. I think the second question I have is it's a question that Dr. Fraser Rahim sort of talks about the whole framing of countering violent extremism and how there are multiple voices that should be heard. And we've seen from Professor Q's presentation and Kasim's presentation as well that there is a diversity of views, whether that is with Islam and Christianity, whether that is within Islam itself. There are groups competing for ascendancy. And to what extent are CVE policies today recognizing some of these internal and external debates that are happening? How much of these CVE policies recognize these, or how much of it is based on whatever is the point of view of who funds the CVE program? So I think the issue of funding, the issues of particular ideas that are peddled by this funding is critical to the whole effectiveness of CVE programs, because we know now that from our presenters that it's more complex, whether that is the role of women that is sometimes relegated to just victims, and we don't see their role as perpetrators, we don't see their role as peacemakers and knowledge brokers, and how they appropriate their own intimate spaces to counter violent extremism. How much of these views, these complicated views, do we see? And I think Dr. Rahim Fraser Rahim, who has worked a lot on CV programs on the ground, just wanted to tap your brains a little bit about how much of these nuances do we see in CV policies, and how much are people who fund these policies willing to accommodate these multiplicity of views. And just to go back, and I hope, Professor Q, that you have a chance to talk a little bit about the faith-based organizations that you were referring to and their role, because it's important as well, not just to focus on Islam, but to know what is happening within the Christian community, because there's always, even in Nigerian discourse, there's always a tendency to pit the North versus the South along the lines of Islam versus Christianity. And along these lines, people engage in global politics, whether it's the policies of Trump or the policies of other politicians. They are often appropriated, understood through this sort of division between regional divisions, but also religious divisions. So it's very interesting to hear the other side as well. But also looking at Kasim's presentation, I think it's illuminating to know that there are all these competing interests within Islam, and moves us beyond a tendency to homogenize Islam, which we often see in many of the policies in countering violent extremism. I think the interesting point I wanted to ask was, why did Boko, because you seem to suggest then that Boko Haram is somewhat different from previous groups in the sense that it was the group that was able to move from, I think you call it, from reform to dissidence and to violence. What is it about Boko Haram that what is it about Boko Haram that it was able to, realize and move and not go back, since it has gone towards the violence aspect? So just trying to understand sort of that difference, but also by extension, the similarities as well between Boko Haram and previous groups as well. But also to raise a further question about, you make a salient point about the need to focus on religion and not just to focus on it as something in passing, but actually that it matters what people say, and it's not easily explainable by socioeconomic factors, even though those matter as well. So just wanted to know to what extent, what the views that people espouse, to what extent does context matter in understanding what they say and what they do? Do you think that the scholars who are focusing on the socioeconomic factors, do you think that they have the point? Is there sort of a relationship between the views that the views that people espouse and the context within which they they carry out their lived realities. Just to leave it at that, and I think some of these questions overlap, so I'll leave it for the participants, for the presenters to sort of tackle any of these. And I think Wheeler would have further questions as well.
I'll jump in real quick on this. I started the conversation out with teeing up the monitoring and evaluation for a reason. Because I think oftentimes if we look at our tools that we're using, depending on who you're talking to, there are different tools of a desired outcome. And so for faith-based communities, and I think this is a really important point, the desire of a heavenly next life abode is more important, and getting a reward of success is important in terms of how programs are evaluated and put together. And so I say that because, I'm working as a reformed former government counterterrorism officer, as a former peace builder, and also working in this space real time, working on programs bringing from these different traditions. And what I would just highlight, and I think it's a tough one that I think just within the context of Islamist communication and engagement, is this, whether you want to call it renewal, tajdeed, islah, ihya, this revival, renewal. I think Muslim communities are finally realizing that what's happened for the past 50 years of external actors, largely coming from the Gulf, including the Saudis and other countries, and then students leaving their rich tradition, as Abdul Basit mentioned, from these XY locations in Africa, and then going there and studying at Islamic University of Medina, they've come back home and bringing a different view of Islam. And that's not me, and I'm not in the interest, that's not my interest to decide on what that Islam should or shouldn't be. But one thing we know for certain is there has been a fundamentalist interpretation that has developed. And that interpretation has also given rise to what we know, at least at a minimum, an Islamist viewpoint that has taken hold in some shape or fashion. And we see that manifested in groups like ISWAP, et cetera, just to name a few. And so I think what African nations, and I've written about this extensively, is they have to decide about what that African Islam, or what that Senegalese Islam, or what that Mozambican Islam, or what that Congolese Islam will look like. Is it pluralistic? Because I can tell you from when I worked on my book and looking at resilience and looking at the community of former nationalists who came out of the Nation of Islam and transitioned to mainstream Islam, they decided to embrace both their American and Muslim identity. Important of embracing their American and Muslim identity was also embracing their African-American legacy as well, and doing it in a means of challenging the state through the legal processes as well. And I think that that's a really important task for African nations that we don't have enough time to engage in now. And last thing I'll say to you is that, in my book, and we've written, I've talked about this too in other settings, is that when we talk about resilience, resilience borrows from engineering. It is the ability to absorb a shock, not to go back to the status quo as before, but to absorb the shock and to move forward. I remind us all that, the vast majority of terrorism laws that were created in African countries post 9/11, they largely was dealing with terrorism financing and anti-money laundering laws. Prior to that, terrorism was, a lot of the laws that were on the books were dealing with it from the colonial era. And so I think African nations, and I say that in a vast, different viewpoints of how that should be carried out, are wrestling through how they should address this, on top of not engaging in extrajudicial killing, not engaging in violent actions, and that maybe from the Western's construct of how we engage in call CVE or PVE or targeted violence, it's a different framing of how African nation states at the federal level and also at the local level and how it's engaged. And I think that also is a really important task for African nations, but also NGOs to engage in a conversations to push. I don't think we have a perfect model yet. I think this is still experimental, and I think that that's okay to say. The work that I've been doing, the work that we do on the outside right now, working with communities, coming up with programs, everyone who's engaging this is experimenting. Even the models that are put out as seen as a sort of as a template, they are very much experimental. So I would just encourage us all just to recognize that. And again, my hopefully quick 5 minutes of saying this I can expand more, but just to allow my colleagues to have more time to as well. I'll stop there.
And if I can just add to what Mohammed said regarding resilience, when we talk about community resilience, it's really a call to focus more on the community to strengthen the community to deal with shocks, but not to the exclusion of the state. I think what's happened in a lot of African countries is, we were just talking about this earlier this morning, is that there's been the contract between state and communities and state and society has been broken, and that contract needs to be restored. And so as part of community resilience, there needs to be a rebuilding of the trust between states and communities. There needs to be a rebuilding of services so that states can provide for people as they should. So it's really, I think, about, I think the place for the state in programs of community resilience is in their ability to engage in the restoration of that contract.
Abdul Basit, you want to go next, or why don't you go ahead and then I'll go?
I think your volume. Yeah.
Okay. So I would love to respond to two issues that Dr. Bimba mentioned. The question of CVE and the whole notion of funding. Now, one of the things we have to understand is that it is not just the community or even the peace builders who are studying the violent extremist group. The violent extremist groups are also studying the people who are responding to them as well. And one of the things that has been fundamental in discrediting most Islamic organizations, especially in Nigeria, is this whole idea of CVE and who is funding it. So, for example, in some of the videos of Boko Haram, they've actually ridiculed the de-radicalization program sponsored by the EU, the prison de-radicalization program sponsored by the EU. I mean, they know about this program because Shekau actually spoke about it in some of his video. And then he did not just speak about it; he actually delegitimized the scholars who are participating in this. So he's saying that how can you have any sense of legitimacy when you are actively collaborating and working with the infidel, quote unquote. So that has also been a very and because of that, one of the things I noticed when I did my field work in Yobe State in the month of October and November of last year, I noticed that some of the scholars, they were very skeptical in their engagement with the CVA program because they were so they had so much concern about their own legitimacy and their and the perception of what their role will be within the community. So people are very. So I remember one of the scholars that I interviewed, even though unfortunately he died last month. This particular scholar, he would not even allow because for other scholars we usually go to their house. I usually go to their house to actually interview them. This particular scholar did not even like. It was so skeptical of anyone even seeing me with him, because he's so concerned about his sense of legitimacy. So the funding itself has been a very big problem, and that's also because when some of the agencies funding the CVA program, they always have their own agendas as well, and in some cases, some of those agendas do not really align with the peace builder, because this peace builders, they know their community better. They know how to present messages to their community. So in some cases, we've had like tensions and frictions between the program or the agendas of the funders of the CVA program and what the peace builders themselves, how they want the programs to be implemented on the ground. I think this is an issue that we need to look at. And then the second question of the role of contest, and how Boko Haram was. I think Boko Haram actually evolved, and Boko Haram got that support it wasn't just because of the ideology. I mean, the ideology is central. I mean, from my own perspective, because watching the way Boko Haram evolved on the ground, I was in ABU Zaria in from 2008 to 2011. And on one single occasion, I was opportune to be in Kinkinau when Mohammed Yusuf, the founder of Boko Haram, actually came to deliver a lecture. He was invited to that lecture by a particular sheikh in Kaduna State known as Al-Gurkari. And one of the things I discovered, I noticed from Yusuf's preaching, the ideology was central, but it was tying the ideology to social economic context, to what was happening around. So the ideology itself is, the ideology or religious idea do not function in a vacuum. It is actually tied to what is happening around. What is happening around gives resonance to the idea. So in some of the preaching of Mohammed Yusuf, for example, I mean, we speak about that, okay, well, we have corruption in the land because the rulers are not adhering to Sharia. They are not following Sharia. It's because they're following secular constitution. Or Mohammed Yusuf would say that, oh, well, political rulers are embezzling money. They are embezzling public funds meant for community projects or taking care of poor people, but they're embezzling those funds because they are not being judged upon by the Sharia. It's because they're using secular constitution. So there's a way it connects religion to what is happening around. I mean, even look at, for example, if you look at the 9/11 Milio in northern Nigeria, most people actually in northern Nigeria supported Bin Laden. I mean, there were jubilation, people were naming their children after Bin Laden. Now, the reason why people supported Bin Laden is not necessarily because they love to see other people die. Number one is because of the ideology, but number two, they also saw that, okay, this is someone that is actually standing against the quote unquote, the hegemonic powers of America, the American interventionist policies in the Middle East, in Palestine, in Iraq, and all of these other countries. So there's always a way that ideas actually tied to particular context, and we've seen this the way it plays out in the case of Boko Haram.
Absolutely. And which is very interesting as well, Dr. Akio, because of your views about when you contrasted Boko Haram with the Niger Delta oil militants, you talked about how they're backward looking, they're historical, but we seem to see that they also have a keen attention to what is happening on the ground, and they're using it. They're using it to disseminate their message. So really interesting how the past and the present continually interact there.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe, I think since, Abdulbasit Kasim sort of got into some of the marketplace of ideas, maybe I'll go to the question you asked about the Christian dimension as well first, because I think that's really important to note that, none of these groups are developing in isolation. There's a marketplace of ideas out there that is tremendously important. And in the Nigerian context, the Christian and the Muslim groups are listening to each other as much as the Muslim groups are listening to the intra-Muslim conversation, and the Christians are listening to the intra-Christian conversation. Across the divide, this is also really, really important. And I think, Boko Haram developed in a context where you see a rising number of Christians in the Northeast through heavy proselytization from Christian movements all across the Northeast and the Middle Belt and into the core North areas, even into Sokoto and places like that. So the sort of rising tide of Christians in that area, I think, is an important piece of thinking about this. And so countering violent extremism has to be balanced, at least in terms of thinking about what is this conversation happening on the Christian side of the ledger, which is getting increasingly shrill. In terms of its perspective on Islam and its pessimism about the ability of Muslims and Christians to get a single political entity. So that's I think an important piece of this. I mean, on the Christian side as well, for instance, I mean the sort of the prosperity narrative that many of, particularly the Pentecostal churches, but it's in all the mainstream churches as well, of talking about how the road to material well-being is through sort of the religious path that they offer. I think you see ideas like that, although certainly very different, but at least influencing conversations on the Islamic side of the ledger. And what's interesting about the prosperity debate is that I think, like the collectivist point I mentioned earlier, is that I think it helps to individualize folks a bit more, in the sense that the materialistic vision is one that, that you pursue at an individual level, that gives you sort of more room and more flexibility. So there's some interesting pieces there. But another piece of the conversation too that's on both sides are perspectives on justice. And I think, not just Boko Haram, but many of sort of the more reformist towards sort of revolutionary groups on the Islamist side are deeply interested in thinking about, well, what is this concept of justice? And in our interfaith, conversations and in dialogue processes, there's actually a lot of really interesting room there on both the Christian and the Muslim side to talk about, well, what do we mean by justice, and there's quite a bit of I think flexibility in some ways in terms of having that conversation, but then leveraging it into a real conversation about, well, how do we together change the way that the state works? Because it's a common, the common theme that everybody shares is that, that the Nigerian state is just not producing what it's supposed to do. I really want to underscore also what you said, or your question at the beginning about where does the state fit into this? And again, I mean, I think I said it in my presentation, but I want to underscore a few things about how important it was that state violence was in the development of Boko Haram. The initial sort of, the Hijra movements being hounded by the police. But initially, what we don't often talk about is how much the government actually courted, Boko Haram and sort of the various proto Boko Haram movements that were bubbling in the late 90s and early 2000s in Yobe and Borno State area there. Many of the politicians would court these groups, would provide them with patronage, and then when they got too strong, would then bring the police down on them. A lot of the folks I've interviewed in Maiduguri, for instance, will joke about how you would go to hear Muhammad Yusuf's sermons, and you would find these big politicians sort of sneaking in, to listen in the back, and how these politicians would court them, would try to use them for legitimacy, and then would beat them down when they became sort of too powerful. So thinking about sort of how the state has this sort of both violent but also encouraging relationship at the same time, I think is important in terms of thinking about reversing this. Maybe one last thing, I know we've got to move on, but I would throw out there is just to think about, again, as all of us are talking about sort of engaging, extremist groups within the conversation that they're having, there's a lot of important points in sort of Yusuf's ideology that are extremely idiosyncratic, almost sort of cultic, in the sense that at least Yusuf and then certainly Shekau as well, the things that they put out there also include beliefs and elements that are far more personalistic and have less to do with Islam. I mean, one of the ones everybody likes to talk about was Yusuf saying that rain doesn't come from condensation and things like that. I mean, there's all kinds of points in their rhetoric that are vulnerable to attack, and to some extent, I think the division within Boko Haram to the Al-Barnawi group and to the Shekau group, there's obviously important politics components there, but there's also a strong dogmatic conversation that's happening there. Shekau went off too far in terms of some of his beliefs, in terms of sort of mainstream ISIS, perspectives in there. I mean, Yusuf also had those. So I think that sort of amplifying these conversations that we've all been talking about, is an important part of this, and that interfaith dialogue tries to sort of open that door for having that conversation. But for instance, on social media and other forums there, amplifying the voices of imams who are not only sort of the doves, but even some of the sort of reformists who maybe we're less comfortable with, but still have a certain measure of legitimacy, like Abdullah Basit was talking about. Those voices can be amplified without undermining their legitimacy. And that providing, sort of flooding the marketplace with more of these ideas provides at least a greater opportunity for youth and other folks to sort of find some of these other ideas, but also to see, a legitimate criticism within the platform of Islam, within the platform of Christianity, to sort of pull down some of these individuals who become sort of personalistic figures and their sort of their idiosyncratic approaches that I think make them vulnerable to criticism and help to sort of undermine at least their popularity.
Thank you so much, Darren, for that sort of expansion on some of the points that have been raised. Wheeler, do we have time for just one or two quick questions from the participants?
I think we can deal with one question. We've already talked about the issue of the role. There was a question about the role of faith-based actors, non-Muslim, and the role of other alternative organizations. What wasn't talked about, I think that would be a great last final question, would be the effect of U.S. policy, U.S. administrations, particularly now that we're in an election time period, the effect on the countering or encouraging violence, especially about a policy that seeks to negate or put down Islam. And then also there was a question about the effect of the AU not having an alternative policy to the present issues of violence. So again, the effect of US policy and the effect of the lack of, or the AU policy.
If I could invite the presenters to just quickly tackle those questions.
I'll be brief. I think, the current Trump administration's policy toward Africa has been a bit hands-off, if to say the least. And I think that, the other previous administrations, including from the Bush era of transformational diplomacy and the era of Condi Rice, there's been, in Obama administration even has been much more engaged. I mean, there's a lot of initiatives, YALI, et cetera. Not enough time to unpack that. I think the most interesting thing is the discussion possibly to, AFRICOM leading in Germany. So there's been talks, I doubt it, I think it would be a perfect time if that is a discussion, which I doubt it will be, to be on the African continent, but the jury is out. But also just the desire of just the current administration kind of leaving our competitors, at least from an American or Western frame, where others have filled that void, including the Russians, the Turks, the GCC countries, the Chinese in particular, who are filling the gaps that historically America has. I think that that has tremendous implications for our posture on the continent, both to work in collaboration, but also Americans' disengagement on the continent. That's all I have.
And also, with the new administration, if we have a new administration, it would be an important opportunity to reset U.S. relations with Africa. As we all have heard, this administration has not referred to Africa in very favorable and respectful terms. So there is an opportunity to reset U.S.-Africa relationships and treat African countries more as partners. I think also in the realm of violent extremism and CVE, it's also an opportunity to perhaps encourage partners to not rely so much on securitized solutions and also be more creative in our approaches to countering violent extremism. I forgot the other strand of thought I was going to add, but those are some of the things that come to mind as well, in addition to involving more regional organizations in some of these broader issues and complex issues that are transnational in nature, and that really should harness the energy of our regional organizations more effectively. So there could be more work to be done by the US with assistance with strengthening Africa's regional organizations to be more involved in handling some of these transnational problems.
Thank you, Audra. Darren, Abdul Basit, anyone wants to take on the whole issue of the role of the African Union in providing an alternative vision quickly?
Sure. Okay, well, sure, I'll go next. Yeah, I think that the African Union definitely has an important role to play in this regard. I mean, its internal structure hampers its fleet-footedness to some degree, but I do think that the fact that it is a regional organization and it has local leadership, I think it could definitely play a role, and I think it precisely because it has not been a major player on the scene so far in this regard. I think it has a certain measure of neutrality and impartiality. Now it could lose that very quickly depending on how it plays its cards. But I think that in particular, if it were to take sort of a respectful engagement role on some of these issues of extremism, and in particular, I think it'd be really, the African Union could be especially effective in taking sort of the approach of trying to elevate moderate voices from across Africa in Islam and Christianity into this context. I mean, I think that might be, and again, I want to underscore what Abdul Basit said earlier about the legitimacy problem. Is that moderate imams, and for that matter pastors on the Christian side, though I think less so, face their lives are certainly potentially in danger depending on how on the stance that they take, and depending on who they're seen as, quote, collaborating with in this regard. And I think an institution like the African Union at least has a bit less sort of collaborationist spin to it than others. And so depending on how the organization moves forward, I think there's a lot of play there. I mean, I would, and on US policy, I just want to definitely echo what was said in terms of, this administration, certainly in terms of targeting Muslim nations with visa restrictions and all that sort of thing, certainly has a real problem in terms of countering violent extremism policy. And that in addition, I mean, being seen as certainly having a Christian tilt in terms of U.S. policy towards Nigeria and other places is a definite problem, and that there is a real chance for perhaps some things to change. And I would again underscore, I think that social media in particular has a really important role to play in terms of scaling. I mean, I feel like the dialogue stuff that I do and we talk about is really, really important, but it's difficult to hit large numbers, and that the social media piece of this is an important dimension we should be thinking about.
Absolutely. Quickly, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to add to what other panelists say. I think it's very important, especially for the African Union, to engage youth. So we're actually having like an increasing population we're having youth bulge across different parts of Africa. And I know that the African Union, they have programs like the Dove program, where they train peace builders. But I think it's important to create more programs to actually engage the youth. I mean, if you look at the EndSARS protest, for example, and not just even the EndSARS protest, even in other form of protests that have actually taken place, whether in Mali, the recent protest against the ousted president, and even other parts of northern Nigeria as well, the youth have actually been central to what transpired in this region. So I think investments in the youth is actually more important. And lastly, it's very important for the Western countries as well, not just the United States, but even the European Union, that when they are engaging with African countries, they should engage with African countries as partners and not necessarily as like superiors. Because what we've seen so far is where some Western countries come up with they tie their support to some policies that have to be implemented within Africa. And one of it is the LGBT policy, for example. And usually when it comes with those strings attached, it's always very difficult for, it's contribute to the delegitimization on the ground, because the moment people see, like funded by EU or funded by the Canadian government, the first thing they think about is, oh, these are the people who are trying to import like that culture. I mean, there's this old sense. So I think it's also very important for the Western countries to be pragmatic in the way they, collaborate and send their soft power, extend their soft power, in Africa.
Thank you so much. I think we've now run out of time, and there are still a lot of issues to discuss. And I would invite the panelists to join us tomorrow as well, so the people with questions can also ask them. So thank you very much to the presenters. I think we've learned a lot about both the concept of violence and countering violent extremism, but as well as the drivers of violent extremism. They've complicated the scene for us a little bit, told us ways in which religion is not a homogeneous space, told us the ways in which the state continues to matter in CB programs, the ways in which there are various voices competing for ascendancy in many religions, especially Islam, women's role beyond just victims and perpetrators, playing a key role as knowledge brokers and peacemakers as well, but also looking at the more global political context and how it plays a key role in shaping CVE programs. Tomorrow, we will focus and turn our attention a little bit more on what works and what doesn't when it comes to countering violent extremism. And some of the issues that have emerged from today's discussion will be extended in that panel. We're looking at US policy, social media, some of those issues I think can help to shape our understanding of what works and what doesn't. We have a fantastic group of panelists ready to discuss some of these issues. So please join us tomorrow, same time, to engage with this topic. Thank you all for participating and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.